I never planned on feeling this way about her. But the closer she came, the harder it became to hide what I used to think distance was safety. That if I just kept my eyes elsewhere, my thoughts elsewhere, I'd never notice her in a way I shouldn't. But life has a way of erasing lines we think are permanent. It began one late afternoon, when the house felt strangely quiet. My dad was away on business, and the air carried that hushed weight of stillness you only notice when someone's absence fills the room. She was in the kitchen, hair loosely tied, wearing a soft sweater that looked as comfortable as it did graceful. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, trying to lift a heavy box from the counter. I stepped closer, taking it from her hands. Our fingers brushed, and for a second, neither of us moved. The box wasn't heavy anymore, but the silence was. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer than usual. Not just polite, but warm. We carried the box to the living room, and when I set it down, I noticed her standing close. Closer than normal. I felt her presence, like heat, like gravity. She gave me a small smile, the kind that wasn't meant for the world, only for the person right in front of her. We ended up sitting on the floor, sorting through the things in the box. Old family photos, keepsakes, random memories tucked away. She picked up a picture of herself from years ago, laughing in the sun, younger but not all that different from now. "I used to think I had everything figured out," she whispered, almost to herself. I looked at her, at the way her smile faded into something more thoughtful. "Do you still feel that way?" I asked carefully. She shook her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "No, life doesn't turn out exactly how you plan." There was a pause, not empty, but charged. My hand moved instinctively, brushing against hers as we both reached for the same photograph. Neither of us pulled away this time. Her skin was warm, delicate, and the smallest tremor ran through me at the contact. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in them, I saw something I hadn't expected, not authority, not distance, but vulnerability. A quiet longing that mirrored my own. She didn't speak, and neither did I. But she shifted closer, her shoulder brushing mine as we sat surrounded by old memories and a silence that felt heavier than words. I knew it was dangerous to linger there, in that closeness. Yet part of me didn't want to leave. Not when her presence wrapped around me like something both comforting and forbidden. And when she finally rested her hand on top of mine, firm but gentle, I realized there was no distance left to run to. As already written, the next morning, the air was crisp with early sunlight spilling across the living room. I hadn't expected her to be awake so early, yet there she was, perched on the couch with a cup of tea, her fingers wrapped around it like it was a lifeline. The quiet rhythm of her breathing, the way her shoulders curved into the blanket, made me hesitate at the doorway. "Morning," she said, not looking up, just letting the warmth of her voice drift through the room. "Morning," I replied, careful to keep my tone casual, though my pulse betrayed me. I joined her on the couch, sitting just a little too close, careful to give space but unable to resist the magnetic pull that seemed to exist between us. She glanced at me then, her eyes catching mine with a softness I hadn't seen before. "You didn't sleep well?" I asked, noticing the faint crease on her brow. She shook her head, letting a small sigh escape. "Just thoughts," she admitted quietly. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup in slow circles, a nervous gesture I hadn't noticed before. Something about seeing her like this, unguarded, real, made my chest tighten. I reached out instinctively, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes lingered on mine, searching, as if asking a question she couldn't voice. The warmth of her skin against my fingers, the faint scent of her perfume, anchored me in a moment that felt suspended in time. "Why do I feel like I've known you longer than I really have?" I found myself saying, almost a whisper. Her lips curved into a half-smile, and she leaned a little closer, just enough that the air between us seemed to vibrate. "Maybe, because some connections don't need years to form," she murmured, her voice low, intimate. We sat like that for a long moment, silence filling the space between us with more meaning than words ever could. Every glance, every small shift in position, carried weight. I felt her knee brush against mine, a subtle, electric contact that made me acutely aware of the space we shared. She placed her hand lightly on my arm, a grounding touch, and I realized how natural it felt to stay there. Close, aware, but unspoken. There was trust in her touch, vulnerability, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension threading through the room. When she finally leaned back, she rested her head against the back of the couch, still keeping her hand near mine. I watched her in the morning light, thinking about how extraordinary it was to feel so connected to someone who was meant to be off limits. And yet, there she was, human, real, breathtakingly present. I knew then that it wasn't about crossing lines. It was about noticing, feeling, and understanding her in a way that transcended simple boundaries. Some attractions were quiet, slow-burning, and utterly impossible to ignore. And in that golden morning light, with her hand near mine and her eyes glimmering with unspoken words, I understood. The heart notices what the mind tries to deny, and some connections simply demand acknowledgement. In my that evening, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, the remnants of her baking earlier in the day. I found her in the kitchen again, humming softly to herself, flour dusting her hands and the counter. There was a rhythm to her movements that I couldn't stop watching, something both graceful and effortless, like she moved through the world on her own quiet terms. "Need a hand?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was already racing. She glanced up, eyes lighting in that way that made me forget half the sentences I'd meant to speak. "If you insist," she said, a playful lilt in her voice. She handed me a rolling pin, and we worked side by side, shoulders brushing, hands occasionally meeting on the dough. Every accidental touch sent a spark through me, and I caught myself holding her gaze just a little too long. We laughed at our shared clumsiness, and for a moment, the world shrank down to just us and the scent of cinnamon in the air. Then, she paused, leaning against the counter, wiping her hands with a towel. Her eyes found mine again, softer this time, and there was an unspoken question there, something vulnerable, tender, that made me hesitate before speaking. "You always make everything feel lighter," I admitted quietly. Her smile was almost shy. "I didn't realize I could," she said, and for a moment, her voice faltered, betraying the quiet vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. I moved a step closer, careful not to overstep, and our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away. She looked down at our touching hands, then back at me, and I felt the subtle tension build between us. Not desperate, not reckless, but undeniable. The warmth of her fingers against mine was steady, comforting, and frightening all at once. "Sometimes, I wish things could be simpler," she murmured, her head tilting slightly, as if confessing to the air itself. "I know," I said, barely above a whisper, feeling my chest tighten. "But maybe some connections are never simple. Maybe that's why they matter." She let out a small laugh, almost like a sigh, leaning just a little closer. The space between us seemed to disappear, not with force, but with the gentle pull of shared understanding. Her shoulder brushed mine, and I noticed how natural it felt to stay close, how wrong it would feel to move away. Finally, she reached out, laying her hand over mine deliberately. Warm, tender, and grounding. "You make it feel less complicated," she said softly, and I realized that, in this quiet, golden kitchen, we'd crossed a threshold, not of actions, but of hearts. We didn't need more than that touch. No words could capture the unspoken depth between us, the quiet acknowledgement that something real had begun. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of baking and the fading light of day, I understood that closeness didn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it only needed to be felt. It was late afternoon when I found her in the garden, sunlight catching the strands of her hair like copper threads. She was kneeling by a small patch of flowers, hands in the soil, humming softly as she worked. The quiet focus on her task made her seem simultaneously strong and delicate, someone fully present in the moment, yet unknowingly drawing me into it. I lingered at the edge of the garden, unsure if I should interrupt, and she noticed me immediately. Her eyes lifted, warm and inviting, and she smiled in that way that made everything around her feel lighter. "Care to join me?" she asked, patting the space beside her. I hesitated for just a second, then sat down, letting my hand brush against hers as I mimicked her motions in the dirt. The contact was fleeting, yet the spark it left lingered, and I felt an odd mix of comfort and longing. We worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and our shared breathing. Then she leaned back, wiping her hands on her apron, and I noticed the faint tension in her shoulders. Sometimes, it's hard to let myself relax, she confessed, voice soft. I feel like I always have to be everything to everyone. I turned to her, noticing the vulnerability hidden behind her usual composure. You don't always have to be everything, I said gently. You can just be. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. The sunlight warmed her face, highlighting the subtle lines of experience that made her presence even more magnetic. Slowly, she reached out, resting her hand over mine. Warm, steady, grounding. I don't know why it feels like this, like we're on the edge of something I shouldn't want, she murmured. Her words trembled slightly, and I realized she was admitting the very feelings I had been trying to ignore. You're not alone, I whispered. I feel it too. Her head tilted slightly, and our shoulders touched. The physical closeness was minimal, but the emotional weight was immense. Every brush of her hand, every subtle shift of posture, carried unspoken meaning. The warmth of her skin, the faint scent of soil and flowers, the soft tilt of her head, it all coalesced into a moment I didn't want to end. We sat together until the sun dipped lower, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber. Finally, she leaned her head against my shoulder, tentative at first, then more assuredly. My arm instinctively came around her, holding her close without pressure. In that silence, with the world fading around us, I understood that connection wasn't about crossing lines or breaking rules. It was about presence, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement that we mattered to each other in a way words could never fully capture. As the light dimmed, we finally stood, hands still lightly touching, sharing a glance that spoke volumes. In that shared warmth, in that soft, lingering contact, we had found a closeness that was real, tender, and utterly ours. No labels needed, just hearts quietly aligned. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the faint hum of distant traffic and the comforting stillness of a home temporarily emptied of obligations. My dad had gone on a short trip, leaving us alone, and for the first time, there was no subtle hesitation in the air, only the quiet opportunity to truly be present with each other. We decided to tackle the attic, a place neither of us had ventured in months. Boxes lined the walls, dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight filtering through the small windows. She moved gracefully among the clutter, her hands brushing against old mementos, lifting photographs with a delicate care that made me want to watch her forever. You always notice things, she said softly, turning toward me with a small smile. Even in the smallest details. I felt a rush of warmth at her words, not just for the compliment, but for the way she looked at me, as though I mattered in a way that was quietly profound. I notice what matters, I replied, and our eyes met, holding the weight of shared understanding. As we sifted through boxes, our hands occasionally met, lingering slightly longer than necessary. She laughed at one of my clumsy attempts to lift a heavy box, and I found myself reaching out to steady her, fingers brushing her wrist. The contact sent a ripple through me, calm, intimate, a mixture of longing and reassurance. At some point, she paused, holding an old book close to her chest. Her gaze drifted to a faded photograph tucked inside its pages. I forgot how much I cherished these, she murmured, voice tinged with nostalgia. Her hand rested lightly on mine, and I felt the quiet weight of trust in that simple gesture. We sat together on the floor, leaning back against a stack of boxes, the afternoon light warming the space around us. She tilted her head toward me, and I leaned in slightly, careful but drawn, as if the space between us were filled with unspoken words. You make everything feel less lonely, she admitted softly. The honesty in her voice struck me deeply. I could feel the subtle tremor of vulnerability in her fingers as they brushed mine. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then let my hand cover hers fully. Warm, steady, grounding. You've never been alone, I whispered. Not with me. She looked up, eyes shimmering, and for a long moment, nothing else existed. No boxes, no attic, no rules. Only the closeness we had nurtured quietly over weeks. She leaned against me, a gentle weight, her presence both comforting and exhilarating. We didn't rush. There were no declarations, no dramatics, just the slow, intimate realization that we had found a space to be ourselves together. Every small touch, every lingering glance, had led to this shared moment of understanding. And in that attic, among forgotten memories and sunlight, I understood something profound. Sometimes, love isn't loud or urgent. Sometimes, it's quiet, patient, and deeply felt, blossoming in the small gestures, in the trust we extend, and in the gentle closeness that tells the heart what words never see. The evening settled softly over the house, the kind of quiet that feels almost sacred. She was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her shoulders, reading a book. The soft lamplight illuminated her face, highlighting the gentle curve of her smile and the faint lines around her eyes, lines that spoke of experience, care, and quiet strength. I hesitated at the doorway for a moment, just watching. The simple sight of her sitting there, completely at ease, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. And yet, there was no rush to act. Only the pull of wanting to be near her, to share the warmth she exuded effortlessly. "Can I sit?" I asked softly, and she glanced up with a small smile. "Of course," she said, patting the space beside her. I sank into the couch, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that our shoulders brushed. It was a light contact, almost accidental, yet electric in its own quiet way. She didn't move away. Instead, her hand rested near mine on the blanket, fingers occasionally grazing each other as we both reached for the book at the same time. For a long while, we read in companionable silence. Each glance we shared carried the weight of unspoken understanding, each small touch reinforcing the bond that had grown steadily between us over weeks. It wasn't dramatic or urgent. It was tender, deeply human, and entirely intimate in its subtlety. She closed the book and set it aside, turning to face me. "I never expected this," she said, voice soft, almost hesitant. "To feel so connected." I swallowed, my heart beating faster than I cared to admit. "Me neither," I replied. "But I think some connections are meant to be noticed, no matter how impossible they seem." She reached out, placing her hand lightly over mine. Warm, steady, grounding. I felt a surge of reassurance in that small gesture, the kind that tells you everything will be okay without a single word. We sat like that for a long time, hands resting together, leaning slightly into each other. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the soft hum of the house and the quiet rhythm of two hearts learning how to be close without rushing, without forcing anything. Finally, she rested her head against my shoulder, tentative at first, then more assuredly. I draped my arm around her, holding her gently. There were no words, and none were needed. The closeness, the trust, and the warmth spoke louder than anything we could say. In that golden, peaceful evening, I realized something simple and profound. Love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it grows quietly, in glances, touches, and shared silences. Sometimes it's in the courage to be near someone, fully present, fully seen. And in that moment, as her hand lingered in mine and her head rested softly on my shoulder, I knew we had reached something rare and beautiful. Not a reckless romance, but a steady, heartfelt connection that would remain, tender and true, no matter what the future held. The weekend had slowed to a soft, almost golden rhythm. The sunlight spilled through the curtains, painting the living room in warm hues. She was seated on the couch, a cup of tea resting on the side table, and I found myself pausing at the doorway, just watching her. There was something about the way she sat, poised yet relaxed, that drew me in, the quiet confidence in her movements matched by a subtle vulnerability I'd come to recognize and cherish. "Morning," she said softly, noticing me for the first time in the day. Her smile was gentle, genuine, a quiet invitation into the moment. "Morning," I replied, moving to sit beside her. The couch felt smaller than usual, but somehow, closer felt right. As I settled in, our shoulders brushed, a small, electric contact that made my heart skip a beat. She didn't pull away, only shifted slightly, as if inviting the closeness without saying a word. We talked about trivial things at first, the weather, a book she had been reading, a funny incident from the previous week. But slowly, the conversation shifted, becoming softer, more honest. Her voice carried a vulnerability I rarely heard, a careful honesty that seemed to trust me with more than just words. "You know," she said, her fingers brushing against mine as she reached for her cup, I didn't expect this. This connection, quiet as it is, feels so important. I felt a rush of warmth at her words, not just because they mirrored my own feelings, but because they revealed her trust. I feel the same, I admitted, letting my hand rest lightly over hers. The warmth of her skin, firm yet gentle, sent a comforting shiver through me. She leaned a little closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. The contact was subtle, safe, yet charged with meaning. "It's strange, isn't it?" she whispered. "How something that shouldn't exist feels so right." I nodded, heart pounding, voice soft. Some connections don't need permission. They just are. Her hand squeezed mine briefly, a simple gesture loaded with emotion. Then, slowly, she rested her head against my shoulder. I draped my arm around her naturally, holding her close without any urgency, letting the moment breathe. The house felt still around us, the quiet punctuated only by the soft ticking of a clock. In that silence, I realized the depth of what had grown between us, an understanding, a comfort, a closeness that transcended age, expectation, and caution. It wasn't reckless desire. It was tender awareness, mutual respect, and an unspoken promise that this connection would remain, nurtured in small gestures, shared glances, and the warmth of presence. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, not needing to speak, not needing to define it. The intimacy was in the shared silence, the touch of hands, the quiet leaning into each other. And as sunlight shifted to soft evening glow, I understood something profound. Some bonds are undeniable, and sometimes, love is simply the courage to be close, fully and quietly, to someone who matters.